and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Siti Haidara from. Okay. Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Siti Haidara from Madison, Wisconsin. I am a rising senior studying political science in the UW-Madison College of Letters and Science. I'm pleased to introduce Associate Clinical Professor of Law, Stephen Wright. Today, Stephen will be discussing the impetus behind his highly acclaimed novel, The Coyotes of Carthage, which received strong reviews from the Washington Post, Salon, and even famed author John Grisham, who acknowledged Stephen as a major new voice in the world of political thrillers. Stephen teaches in both law and creative writing at UW-Madison. At the law school, he is an associate clinical professor in the Remington Center, a collection of clinics that provide students with the opportunities to represent men and women serving time in Wisconsin's prisons. He also led the Wisconsin Innocent Project for 5 years before starting the Constitutional Litigation, Appeals, and Sentencing Project earlier this year. Please welcome Stephen Wright.
Thank you so much, Siti, for that warm and wonderfully presented introduction. And good afternoon to you all. My name is Stephen Wright, and as Siti said, I teach both in the law school and in the English department. Proudly, I say, here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've lived in Madison for about nearly a decade. I arrived in 2012, leaving a career as a voting rights lawyer to enroll in Wisconsin's world-renowned Masters of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program, and to pursue my dream of becoming a writer. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today, and I want to give a special thank you to Fran and everyone else at Badger Talk Live, as well as everyone at University Communications who have been so supportive and who made this lecture possible, and most importantly, who invited me here to share my thoughts about creative writing and my experience as a civil rights and constitutional litigator, the former co-director of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, and in the past 17 months as a debut novelist. Indeed, April 14th, 2020 was a day that changed my life. And though it feels like yesterday, I'm reminded that it was a day early in the pandemic when my book was set to launch. It was a time marked by uncertainty and fear and a sense that the world might at any moment begin to burn. And right in the middle of this is when HarperCollins released my debut novel, The Coyotes of Carthage. The novel, which took me about 4.5 years to write, follows the experience of a flashy, big-time African-American political consultant who, after a series of personal and professional missteps and misfortunes, is sent to the fictional county of Carthage, South Carolina. I want to say a couple things before we sort of get into the meat and until we get sort of into the substance of the story. But, you know, the main character being sent to South Carolina, it's a punishment for sure. And it's his last best chance to save his career. His mission is pretty simple. He's got to persuade the people of Carthage to vote in favor of a ballot initiative that would sell the county's most valued resource, tens of thousands of acres of pristine South Carolina wilderness, to a minerals and mining corporation that wishes only to devastate the land for their own profit. In short, the novel hopes to explore how a community comes to act against its own interests. The novel was informed by my experience as a lawyer for the United States Department of Justice, where I worked for 5 years as a trial attorney in the voting rights section. In that job, I and my colleagues, many of whom became my closest and dearest friends, would travel around the country and visit communities where our democracy had fundamentally broken down. In particular, I spent a lot of time in the States, mostly in the South, who were subject to the preclearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act before, in 2013, the United States Supreme Court, in its wisdom, effectively struck down the most effective and most transformative component of the most successful civil rights legislation in modern American history. In my duties at the Justice Department, visiting those sections, visiting those jurisdictions subject to the Section 5 requirements, those outlined on the map here, I often found myself in small towns that often felt like bubbles, time capsules of a bygone era. And I used these experiences visiting these small towns to inform the creation of Carthage, where my novel is set. And I wanted to share my experiences in those places, my thoughts about those places, and to share the stories of people I met in places like Carthage. And so that brings me to what I think I want to talk most about today. And it's one of the aspects of writing and fiction that most excites me, the role of place and community in storytelling. And perhaps I should begin by acknowledging a simple truth. I may have a chip on my shoulder on this topic. Amongst writers, you'll often hear novelists or fiction writers claim that they write, or as writers like to pretentiously say, that their concern is the character-driven story. Other writers, most often those who make a fair amount of money at the craft, take pride in calling their work plot-driven. Now, to be quite truthful, I don't know what either of those really mean, character-driven or plot-driven. I've studied writing for 10 years, have 2 master's degrees in it, and now I'm privileged to teach it here at the university, and somehow those words are meaningless to me. But nonetheless, I've decided to join the fray. And as I enter this fray, as I say before, with a slight grudge, because I feel so strongly that place is as important an element as plot or character, I want to say, quite frankly, that I think place often gets cheated. It gets short stripped. It is the victim of slights and neglect. And so for the next few minutes, I want to offer my defense of place as an engine of storytelling, and to share with you how I became a novelist who proudly writes place-driven stories. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not the first writer to jump to the defense of the centrality of place in fiction writing. Indeed, less than a century ago, writers often identified themselves with particular regions and landscapes. Today, in high schools, we still teach the works of New England writers in the early days of the Republic. Take, for example, The Scarlet Letter, which could easily be read as a novel about a woman who wears a red A on her chest. But I would suggest it makes much more sense that we consider the novel an examination of the kind of cruel community, the original Town Without Pity, a community whose moral code would force a single mother to wear such a symbol and to punish her for her sin. And then, of course, we teach the stories of Southern masters like Mark Twain, William Faulkner, and Eudora Welty. And with these discussions, with these writers, often comes discussions of the South, and comes, of course, a discussion of the South's history, as well as its legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. In fact, each of these Southern writers, Twain, Faulkner, and Welty, have offered their thoughts in essays and interviews, as well as lectures about how they see the South and the role that regionalism plays in their work. For those of you who might not be familiar with her work, Eudora Welty was a white writer who was born and died in Mississippi, and who is best known for her narratives exploring 20th century the 20th century American South. During her career, she won a host of elite awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal for the Arts, several O. Henry Prizes, and in 1973, the Pulitzer Prize for her outstanding novel, The Optimist's Daughter. Upon her passing in 2000, the New York Times obituary named her the most revered figure in contemporary American letters. I should say that Welty too shared my sense that place is a much maligned, underappreciated, and undervalued element of fiction. I'd like to share with you three short excerpts from her seminal essay on place, an essay that is now more than 60 years old and that is still taught in creative writing programs across the country. She begins the essay with a simple observation that place is one of the lesser angels that watch over the racing hand of fiction. Perhaps the one that gazes benignly enough from off to one side, while others like character, plot, symbolic meaning, and so on, are doing a great deal of wing beating about her chair. And feeling, who in my eyes carries the crown, soars highest of them all and rightly relegates place into the shade. Nonetheless, it is this lowlier angel that concerns us here. There have been signs that she has been rather neglected of late. Maybe she could do with a little petitioning. Now the essay goes on, it's a relatively short essay, maybe about 10 pages. But Eudora Welty goes on to say that place in fiction is the named, identified, concrete, exact, and exacting, and therefore credible gathering spot of all that has been felt, is about to be experienced in the novel's progress. Location pertains to feeling, feeling profoundly pertains to place. Place in history partakes of feeling, as feeling about history partakes to place. Every story would be another story and unrecognizable as art if it took plot and happened somewhere else. And then lastly, she goes on next to say, feelings are bound up in place, and in art, from time to time, place undoubtedly works upon genius. Can anyone well explain otherwise what makes a given dot on the map compassionately alive, for good and all in a novel, like one of those Nueve that suddenly blaze with inexplicable fire in the heavens? What brought a Wuthering Heights out of Yorkshire, or a Sound and the Fury out of Mississippi? You know, her essay has influenced a lot of the way that I think of place. And one way to think about the value of place in fiction is that it provides one with an opportunity to explore different ways of being, to immerse oneself generally in character, situation, and place, and to learn vicariously through nature. But stories driven by place, especially, are more specific and often more rich. They challenge the reader to examine communities that are not their own, to understand the institutions, as well as the political, economic, cultural, and environmental values that govern other people's lives. These stories invite conflict and tension, oftentimes completely unresolvable. And on a very basic elementary school level, the sense of place provides an opportunity to evaluate the age-old conflict of man versus society. But today, increasingly, I think place-driven narratives ask us to examine the conflicts between societies and cultures. Indeed, indeed, it seems to me that our modern culture wars are indeed a question of place, what one's community looks like, what values they hold, and how they engage with the values of others. Increasingly, our place-driven narratives also ask us to turn around and point our fingers at ourselves and interrogate our own communities. And for me, that's a great starting point. Of course, while I agree and wholeheartedly embrace Walty's observation of the power and the role of place in storytelling, for me, place is a very intimate and personal element. If pressed, I would suppose that my fascination with place is a function of my childhood. For most of my youth, my family moved around every few years. And these weren't just small moves from one neighborhood to another, or from one side of the town to another. They were moves on a global scale. With each move, I had to learn the norms and values of a new community. For 6 of these years, my father was a military officer. The Army paid for him to go to medical school, and in exchange, he served as an Army physician. And so for a while, we lived on Army bases in Alaska and West Germany, when there was, of course, a West Germany, a place that doesn't even appear on the map, and sometimes my students look confused when I refer to it. On military bases, we, like nearly everyone else, were proud Americans, both the faithful and patriots, who felt the call of duty to serve and to defend our nation. Military communities, by their nature, are communities of transients, no one staying for more than a few years, with a change of guard every so often, coming with a new generational energy. The military community, despite its shared bonds and sense of purpose, is also a microcosm of America, with families from states and territories, races and religions, political views and life experiences. And therefore, the basis could too be a microcosm of many of the challenges that our nation faces. But I didn't quite realize that at the time I lived there. I was actually quite young. After my father left the military, we moved to Spokane in Eastern Washington. And on the first day of school, I met with my first cultural shock. I was sitting in homeroom in 7th grade, sitting next to a kid who I hoped to befriend because he was the first person upon whom I laid eyes. And I asked him, "How long have you lived in Spokane?" He looked at me confused, his face sour with irritation, and he replied, "All my life." It was one of the first surprises that I would learn about Spokane, a community that was 95% white. And it was a time where I sort of first had to learn how to navigate a community that was entirely different from anything that I knew before. I, for example, was often the first Black student many of my classmates would meet. And in truth, I met a variety of different people in Spokane. I met my first skinhead, and for that matter, I met my second, third, and fourth skinhead. And believe it or not, throughout my life, I would meet many, many more. But most importantly, I learned how our communities shape us, how our local communities and institutions and the people we know can dictate how we respond to new ideas, to new situations, to new threats, and to new people. How our communities set the standard by which we judge so much of the world around us. These skills of assessing place, developed in my youth, were essential tools during my time at the United States Department of Justice. We would arrive in these small towns and immediately a sense of the political, social, cultural, and environmental conditions of these communities became apparent. You might drive through the downtown of a depressed city and not see a single bank or investment firm, but instead residents had their choice of payday lenders, bankruptcy and paternity lawyers, and pawn shops. You might see in the yards of most residences the rebel flags and other symbols representing pride in the Confederacy. And in the era that I worked in the Justice Department, which overlapped with the early days of the Obama administration, I could see firsthand the rise of the Tea Party and the Tea Party's influence on local politics and culture. In those days, I was young, in my early 20s, not long out of law school, and honestly quite naive. I was often shocked at the anger and the mistrust that folks held, especially in these small, desperate towns, the anger and mistrust that they had against Washington and the federal government. And moreover, I was often found myself so confused when I met with individuals who didn't give a thought to eschewing what I perceived was their own self-interest. I can't tell you how often I met with families that were marred by deep poverty and physical illness, on their deathbed illness, who became enraged at the mention of the Affordable Health Care Act or Obamacare and the potential expansion of Medicare. And strangely enough, too often, these same folks would blame me personally as a representative of the United States and send with me messages to take back to Washington, as though I sat around in the Oval Office with the President of the United States every day, and we discussed his secret plans to turn our nation into a bastion of socialism. And it was these people and these places and these experiences that informed my novel, The Coyotes of Carthage. And I'm proud to say that this novel is a place-driven novel. Carthage, South Carolina, again, is a fictional place. It is a small, religious, conservative, rural town that too is caught in a bubble of a bygone era. In the novel, and this is a quote from the book, 80% of the residents are registered Republicans. The remaining 20% are independents, former Republicans who thought the party has gone too soft. Now, I want to make a couple things clear going forward. I began writing this book in 2014, long before candidate Trump descended his golden escalator at Trump Tower with his wife in tow to pilot one of the most unexpected presidential victories in recent memory. Indeed, by the time candidate Trump became President Trump, the novel was nearly completely written and I was deep into revision. As I said before, the novel follows the experience of a down-on-his-luck African-American political consultant who enlists several local Carthage residents to legitimize his efforts. The two most prominent of his recruits are Tyler and Charlene Lee, who reminded me of many of the folks that I met in these small towns I visited while at the Justice Department. Like many of these folks, the Lees were, on a very personal level, kind, warm, and friendly. They were generous people who cared deeply about their families and their community. They valued what they perceived to be hard work and fair play. And yet, at the same time, the Lees, like many I met, were dirt poor, conservative, and very mistrustful of both government and secular institutions. Tyler Lee, in particular, is the kind of frustrated guy who boasts that he's willing to take up arms and to give his life to protect the Constitution as he sees it. They represent their community, and to the political consultant who uses them, they reflect the will of the good people of Carthage. And while, yes, I'm interested in these people and their lives, I'm most curious about the community that forges such characters. What is the machinery of everyday life? The machinery of place that can produce a Tyler and Charlene Lee. Like when I read The Scarlet Letter and I wonder about early Puritan towns that would shame Hester Prynne and Hester ostracize her daughter Pearl, I wonder about the community and the local institutions that produce folks like the Lees. In recent months, I can't help but thinking about the Lees and the people of Carthage. And although they are fictional, they are very still much on my mind. I wonder whether Carthage weathered 2020. I know deep down that the community has low vaccination rates and that most folks, including the Lees, probably question whether President Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. Part of me fears that Tyler Lee, the brash, over-the-top patriot, was in the Capitol on January 6th, and I wonder what about Carthage might have made him and folks like him respond to the last year as they did. Indeed, it is a question that I ask myself in general these days. Without a doubt, 2020 America will remain etched in our collective consciousness for a very long time. The past 15 months, we as a nation have weathered a pandemic, a divisive presidential election, riots and unrest, anger and justified outrage at the treatment of Black men at the hands of police officers. These events seem to only deepen existing divisions within our nation. 2020 was a place in and of itself, and I have no doubt in the coming years that writers of fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and drama will spend a lot of time trying to discuss and examine and figuring out how best to convey the reality and passions of the year. And I suspect, more importantly, that writing courses in the future, professors like me will ask their students to describe the world during the pandemic, the ethos of the community in which they lived, and how that ethos played out in their day-to-day lives. I know our students, for example, often associate the pandemic with their isolation, which makes a lot of sense to me. And no doubt every single faculty member has seen the students via Zoom, often crowded with their friends in a small house or apartment. And who amongst the faculty has not seen a student on Zoom suddenly surprised when a roommate bursts unexpected into the bedroom to fetch a book or a blanket, or a pet, a cat or a dog, lumps up begging for a treat? And perhaps here's a good place to pause and to make a special note. For most of this discussion, I've been talking about my use of place in my stories and my life, or as Welty suggests in her essays, the machinery to develop characters and plot forged in the fire of place. I also should acknowledge that entire parts of the literary landscape are dedicated to place and the conventions that surround it. I'm not just talking about stories rooted in regionalism that I began this discussion with, but I'm also talking about entire genres. Can one imagine the Western taking place anywhere outside of post-Civil War American West? Historical novels, by definitions, ask readers to concern themselves and to consider a different time and a different place than the one in which the reader lives. So much of African American literature in particular dedicates itself to place. Indeed, Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison once described African American literature as close kin or an expansion of Southern literature. That is, it's rooted so much in a sense of place. It's rooted in this idea of that African Americans face a special challenge and obstacles that are much higher and harder to overcome than for others in our community. These obstacles and challenges are built into the machinery that creates people. And this machinery often is so much the subject of the challenges that a character might have to overcome in a novel. I've been impressed also in my creative writing classes how often my students remind me that the genres of science fiction and fantasy are too a function of place, with science fiction imagining a world that has experienced major technological, scientific, or environmental changes, and fantasy novels that explore the world never possible, worlds full of magic and wonder. These students remind me that if, as the critics say, if the superheroes featured in our era of blockbuster movies are close cousins to the Greek gods of old, then surely places like Gotham City and Wakanda are modern examples of Olympus. Indeed, where would most celebrated science fiction and fantasy tales be without Middle Earth or Westeros or Tatooine and Hogwarts? And so, in conclusion, I want not only to make the case for the place-driven novel, but I also invite you to reflect upon place in your own life. As I said, 2020 was remarkable, and it changed the way that each of us interacted with our community, with our loved ones, with our work, with each other. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much for sharing that story and the background on this exciting novel that you've written. Hello, everybody. Fran Paleo-Moyer, Badger Talks producer. So a couple of questions for you, and everyone feel free to post questions in the chat and we'll relay those to Stephen. So you talk a lot about place, and I see the impact and how your story revolves so strongly around place and the places that you experienced as a child. One other element we're seeing, though, is what an amazing storyteller you are. And even in your description, as you're telling us, your storytelling is just engaging. Can you tell us, as a youth, was storytelling a part of your upbringing?
You know, it really was. And it was sort of in two ways. You know, I as a child was probably more addicted to the rest than to television. So for all those parents who often try to get their children away from the television set, I say that's a bad idea. Embrace it, let them sit in front of the television for as long as they want. But you know, for me, narrative is one of the best ways to just share personal experience. It's one of the best ways to share anecdotes and emotions and thoughts. And so very early on, you know, sharing what I had to feel was often in narratives. And I think that's actually pretty traditional in African-American culture in particular. You know, the ability to sort of share what you're thinking and feeling in this under the confined strengths of storytelling.
I love that. So you're telling me the hours and hours of Gilligan's Island that I watched was not all at a loss of time.
Well, I don't know if I would recommend Gilligan's Island, but yes, somewhere in there.
Okay, so another question for you. So obviously you have this background as a lawyer, and then you also have this background as a writer. Your task in both cases is to influence or impact others. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that and how those two careers essentially align in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, in both cases, I'm trying to use narrative to persuade others. In fiction, we're trying to persuade people of the authenticity, sometimes we call it the vermicitude of the narrative, that we're telling you a story that you know, often we're trying to hope that you believe could be true. And we're trying to persuade you that the struggles of a community, of a person, of a situation are real, that they're not just far-fetched, that there's something that could happen. And on the other side, in law, we're often using narratives to persuade people to reach certain outcomes. You know, for me, I talked to so many people who were watching the Derek Chauvin trial, and they realized that a trial really is just a form of a narrative. Now, it's often the slower, a little bit more boring type of a narrative, but they can often see how each of the parties put pieces of a puzzle together to form a stronger, larger picture that indeed is rooted in narrative. And obviously, those are essential in determining the guilt and innocence. It's the way that juries reach their decisions and appellate court reviews those decisions.
Right. Tell us, for budding writers out there, obviously reading novels, but some of the amazing writers that you've mentioned, of course, is training grounds, but any other tips in terms of training for budding writers?
I tend to think that that obviously reading and reading widely is most importantly. I also tend to believe that it's very important to have a community of writers to which you belong. I completely understand that not everyone can pursue graduate level writing studies, and more importantly, not everyone should. But one of the greatest gifts of an MFA program, that's the terminal degree, often in creative writing, is that it gives you a built-in community. And so it's not only the classmates that you have in your workshop or the faculty who lead those workshops and help you write your thesis and write stories, but it's an opportunity, like here in Wisconsin, to talk to undergrads. I can tell you that when I came here in 2011, I had never even, I was completely unfamiliar with Game of Thrones. And I came here and it was all the students wanted to talk about. Like, the number of times students had written a story that was essentially a knockoff of Game of Thrones was sort of astounding. And because I didn't know it at that time, I often didn't know it, but I kept finding the conversation in class would be like, oh, this reminded me of this and that or in Game of Thrones. And so, even the contribution of the students sort of helped me understand, what motivates readers, what readers like, what they respond to. And so, like I said, not everyone could do an MFA program, but if you can get mentors to help you or people with whom to discuss the elements of writing and people to help you understand, what's popular and why, those things I think are priceless.
Great. Thank you so much for that information. That's wise advice. So Murmurs of a TV show around the Coyotes of Carthage, and what about book tour? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so starting with the book tour, the book tour was scheduled for April 14th, 2020. I remember, I think what campus closed the last week of March, somewhere around there, 2020. And I can remember being on calls with my agent and the publicity team at HarperCollins. And, even that last week as things were starting to close, we were still very optimistic that there might be a book tour. We didn't cancel the plane tickets. We didn't, and then all of a sudden it felt like during the span of 3 or 4 days, we just started getting email after email that venues were closing. So that the bookstores or the libraries or the museums where we had scheduled events, they just would not be open. And so, we went from, I think, what was going to be a 2-3 week book tour, visiting, however many cities, to all of a sudden, just sort of freezing things. And this was in the early days of the pandemic where, Zoom had not even become a household name. I don't think I'd even heard of Zoom at that period. And, we as a writing community were really giving a lot of thought to how we can help indie bookstores during this time, because indies, I think, rely so much upon the traffic of people coming in and out during to make their profits and to stay sustainable. And so, the what was meant to be a 2-3 week book tour actually turned out to be probably a 3 month book tour with lots of different Zoom meetings of different sizes. We were very lucky to still be able to have our launch here in Madison, Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Book Fair. And, it was, in some ways it was very gratifying. We got I think a couple hundred people to show out. And for me in particular, it was great because it was able to bring into one space on this important night people from all around the country who had always been a part of my life who would not have been able to participate otherwise. So, it ended up having a silver lining. On the book and television front, I'm very, very excited. The company called Calvary Media, who is probably best known for House of Cards on Netflix, bought the option to it. We have regular meetings or in regular contact to finalize a TV show. I'm hopeful that we'll have some bigger news to announce in the next 2 months. But it's been fascinating to sort of learn how Hollywood works and to talk to people who work behind the scenes on television shows that I love, sort of the faceless individuals who, are sort of essential to making the stories right, or to making the stories come alive, but who aren't necessarily, household names. And so, my fingers are crossed, but, right now we're planning a 10 episode arc, I think, for season 1. So, much like in publishing, my sense in Hollywood is that anything can sort of fall apart at any moment for any reason. But I think it's encouraging that, we've gotten this far, thus far.
Well, Stephen Wright, thanks so much for joining us today. And I have to say, John Grisham isn't the only one who believes exciting things are happening in your future, and we'll be all excited to watch with anticipation and watch you continue to develop your career as a writer. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Everybody, please join us next week, Tuesday, July 20th at noon again. We'll be talking to Dr. Mary Thurber, and we'll be talking about her life and career as a zoo veterinarian and some interesting cases in working with exotic animals at the Henry Vilas Zoo here in Madison. As always, please visit us at badgertalks.wis.edu, where you can see our upcoming schedule of live events and other hosted public talks. Sign up for our email list. Consider a donation to Badger Talks, as we're supported by grants from the Alumni Association. Or you can search our roster of over 400 speakers that you can invite to speak at your next event or training. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next week.